And one of the things that I think is important is that when we're talking about metacognition and reflection, we're asking people to attend to what is in here. And this kind of like internal process. And that usually, even in our lives, we're asked to attend to like in here, using that as kind of our metaphor, it's often in reference to our thinking about what's out there. So this is something that our ability to willfully direct our attention is in no small measure really kind of a key skill in both metacognition and reflection. But this is actually a pretty radical departure from what we are typically trained to do and what we are given a whole lot of society-oriented kind of clues to do. For instance, like, our muscles of attention, the way I think of them, are very weak. And even if we once knew how to use them, it is more like physical training. Like, I have not gone and lifted weights in a long time. Therefore, I cannot assume that I will be able to lift what I once was able to. So it's kind of the training of the attention is something that we don't give a whole lot of thought to. And in addition to that, in my opinion, the idea of an information economy, the one thing that is constantly kind of being played for and competed for is attention. So I have noticed, as somebody who does meditation, that although in theory you should get better at doing meditation the longer you go, I find, frankly, the more I use technology, the less good at it I am, because there's this constant blaring for attention. So I think that is something that is important for us to recognize with our students. So again, all of this requires us to have kind of a practice of being able to, what was the word, like back up. Back up is what was used in 3 different things. Back up and attend inside for a few moments. So I would like to invite you to have an experience for a few minutes, and we'll see how this goes. So if you would be willing to get yourselves comfortable, put your feet on the floor, and close your eyes for a moment. We're going to do an imaginative exercise and a bit of attention work. So if you can just take a deep breath and relax. And what I'd like you to do is to imagine some time in which you were kind of doing people watching, in that kind of interested, detached, kind of curiosity moment that does not have judgment, but just is kind of about watching. And hold on to that feeling of that kind of detached curiosity. And now we're going to spend 3 minutes, just watch your own mind. Just watch it in the same kind of detached way that you would watch if you were doing people watching. Just observe it. So now what I would like you to do is, I gave you some paper, just write for literally a minute on what was that like. There's your minute. So, now let's see if we have enough people. If we can turn around, and do we have basically try to get into a group of 2? And what I'd like you to do is have a quick conversation with each other about 2 different things. How did it actually feel? How does all of this right now feel? And then also, what do you think the lessons are in terms of teaching and learning? What does this tell you that would be of use to you in working with students? Thank you, everybody. So what I'd like you to do right now is quickly take a look in yourself and write down 2 words about how are you feeling in this moment. And then once you've done that, I have given you something here. It's called a feeling inventory. This is for the nonviolent communication people, but I find it really dead useful. Take a look, it's 2 sides. Find a word in there, and is it more, what I'm interested in is whether or not it is more specific and helps you clarify a little bit more what you are actually feeling in this moment. Oh, the handouts are back there. So just what you know what this is and why I'm giving this to you is that, so first of all, I find this to be a really useful kind of chart. So more or less the way in which it's used in this particular system is there's the feelings of when you're satisfied and the feelings of when you're not satisfied. But what I find particularly useful is just having a list of all of these different emotions, because the ones in the bold heading are usually the ones that are kind of our go-to, but often the ones under there give a little bit more specificity to how we're actually feeling. And we are not often in situations in which we are called to attend to our emotions and to be aware in that kind of metacognitive way of what are we actually experiencing in our moment. And as I will get into in just a second, this has tremendous impact on our thinking. So I like this as a tool. And one of the possible ways of getting people trained in doing this is to set up different periods in a class in which you just suddenly say, stop, what are you thinking and what are you feeling? Give me, write down a word. And to just do that self-regulation so that people are aware. Because by and large, a lot of the research is demonstrating that there's the experiencing self, which is in the moment, and then there's kind of the remembering self is the word that I think it was Kahneman that was using, which is the way in which we create narratives about how we're experiencing reality, and that's our sense of self is in the remembering self, not in the self that is actually experiencing things in the moment. And it's really easy for the experiential self to actually be almost completely annihilated from our sense of self-concept, because we're just not aware, and that's not something that, again, we're really giving a lot of attention to in this culture. So Now I'm going to give you a quick summary of a bunch of research that is, and I need to be sure again, remember, Gwendolyn, not a sage. So this is my take on a bunch of different things as I am attempting to understand them. So my filters are that I am not a specialist, but I'm interested in application. So how many of you are aware of like the work of Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow? Okay. So yeah, he's the, I was reading some of that. So some of the people, I've given you a handout of kind of some of the, oh, it's not this one, on the back, some of the sources. So Daniel Kahneman is the person who won the Nobel Prize because his research was basically showing that the reason that economic theory never works is because it presupposes that human beings are rational actors, and we are not. So I think that's the first piece of this. And then he's got a whole long list of a bunch of things that tend to be, causes of challenge. So basically, my understanding, as I am like trying to understand all of this different research and what it says about the world, is that more or less, the vast majority of our mental processes are based on pattern recognition. The way in which we seem to learn is that we have particular experiences and we develop these models of this is the way the world works based on these experiences, and then we're constantly kind of refining them as we go through life. But most of this is happening below the threshold of consciousness. And so this is what Kahneman calls system one. It's where we have all of those immediate gut reactions and kind of what we experience as intuitions. And that the vast majority of our thinking happens at that level, in just these like flash judgments that we're constantly making. Now, this sounds like it is a big problem, and it can be a big problem because this is where a lot of our cognitive errors live. On the other hand, it does actually get us through life because anyone who has tried to be completely consciously aware in every moment when they're driving knows that people who do that are terrible drivers. So this is something that actually works very well for us for the most part, but we need to be aware that this is kind of how it's functioning, is that and it's running on pattern recognition, like I said. So basically, the other form that Kahneman calls system 2 is where all of our higher order thinking lives. But it only gets activated when system 1 fails and knows that it fails. So there's a big issue right there in that, it doesn't get kicked in. We don't engage our higher thinking unless system 1 both fails and in some way we recognize that it has failed. If not, we just keep going with our gut. So system 2 is, the issues with system 2, as he's calling it, these higher order thinking skills, is that it is lazy. It will take shortcuts at every possible opportunity. And the reason that it is lazy is because it is easily depleted. There's only so much of this that we can really manage. And I will say, by the way, reading Kahneman is depressing as hell. You just go like, I cannot trust myself. I fell into every one of those. I am bad. So, but at the same time, there are ways, I think, to take a more positive interpretation of some of that. So, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote both The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind, his metaphor that he uses is the elephant and the rider, which is actually taken from a number of Indian philosophical and religious traditions as well. And that is this idea that the vast majority of our mind is the elephant. And then a tiny portion of our mind is the rider on the elephant. And the rider can attempt to steer the elephant in different ways. But if the elephant decides that it's going to do something, it can ignore the rider. So it's like trying to figure out how to develop this kind of collegial relationship in a lot of ways between the elephant and the rider is kind of the way in which he's talking about it. Some of the other things that are coming out of this is that human beings are absolutely social animals. Aristotle, of course, said that man is a political animal, by which they mean social. And Jonathan Haidt uses a metaphor of human beings are 90% chimp, which are, of course, trooping animals. So they're, again, social, and 10% bee, which is where we can really get into a moment of subsuming ourselves into like a hive mind kind of situation. And I mentioned before that we are almost entirely attached to the remembering self and not the experiencing self. And the remembering self is what constructs stories. So having looked at a bunch of this, what I am personally most interested in is, and I have a background in ancient Greek religion and philosophy, and that's kind of where I like to live. That's my happy place. And in ancient Greek philosophy, there's always two questions. The first one is, what is the nature of reality? And then the second one is, what does this mean for how we can live a good human life? And I think that's the one that to me is particularly important when we're talking about this. So, for instance, whereas Kahneman is concerned about our storytelling sense of self as, really kind of creating an untrue picture of the world, and there's a lot of bias that lives in that, there's also tremendous opportunities to construct meaning, and if you don't do that, what's the point of having a human life? It's kind of part of what I take away from this. So, what I'm interested in personally is trying to understand where are these places that we run into trouble, and then how is it that we can actually use the systems that we have to make things better. So that's kind of my orientation on this. So again, part of the big challenge then is that a huge portion of our thinking is by necessity in this kind of automatic place. And that's also where we have, a lot of those flash judgments. Part of this, so this is my hypothesis, and this is a hypothesis, and it's one I am still working with. My hypothesis, looking at a lot of both the research that is coming out on this, that is clearly demonstrating that we are not just, high-functioning, thinking, rational beings. And also, when I go and look at a number of the wisdom traditions and contemplative traditions across a lot of different, my background's in comparative world religion, so that's, again, where I go, is that, I'm not sure that this distinction that we make between thinking and feeling isn't a total delusion. I'm not sure that it actually exists. And so that's kind of my hypothesis that I'm wondering about at this moment. Because it seems pretty clear to me from the research and then from other things that when we are thinking, we are also feeling. And when we are feeling, there's typically cognitive content. And so these things may be completely interdependent, which is part of why I was asking, what are we feeling? And so I think that they are pretty much always operating at the same moment. I'm also going to point out that, when we look at, I think that this understanding of this radical divergence that we tend to carry around, not just in academia, but in society, of the distinction between thinking and feeling, I think it probably comes out of a particular historical moment in the development of European cultures. Because when you go back into the ancient Greek sources, which I like to do, and as I said, it's my happy place, and a lot of people will turn to Plato and Aristotle, but when they're talking about the rational being, I don't think they mean it in the same way that it's interpreted later. Because if you look at the rational virtues, they include things like courage and magnanimity and generosity and friendship, which we would say have a strong affective element to them. So I don't think that's what they were talking about. I think that this is a misinterpretation going backwards. So basically, by the time of now, we're in a culture where the idea of reason, if it takes account of feeling at all, we have this idea that it needs to be purified, that it's a taint, that distorts in some way our knowledge. So we're supposed to focus on suppressing that. And what I would say, what I think out of that, first of all, just as a question, if we talk about people who think without feeling, isn't that our functional definition of a psychopath? And is that really what we want? I mean, that's one thing that I have a real question about. So there's that, and I don't think this would necessarily be a good thing to try to actually purify out all feeling. But also, in this, so as a critique, in this culture, our capacities for thinking versus feeling, as we have made this distinction, become gendered. There's a whole lot of really nasty stuff that we could go into a critique about that, and how this is used in terms of ideology that it's upholding. But I think that for the purposes of this workshop, if we have this idea that you have to purify your thinking of all effective content, this incentivizes us to be remarkably unaware. It incentivizes us to be blind to our feeling. And we're talking about metacognition and reflection. We have strong incentives to not be aware of what our feeling is and how it may actually be affecting our consciousness. So The research shown by people like Kahneman and Haidt and so forth show that we're really deluding ourselves if we are not aware that we are feeling while we are thinking. And if we're unaware of it, we can't take account of it, and we can't see how it is actually impacting what we're doing. And that has very real consequences. So for instance, on a very just practical level, there's been research that the further your sentencing is from when the judge ate lunch, the harsher your sentences. So, and that's just real. So those are real impacts. Also, we're less likely to recognize our confirmation bias or our kind of whataboutism, which is, from ourselves or others, if we're not aware of how we're feeling when we're thinking. So that's one soapbox. So additionally, and this is something that I personally think is very interesting to me, if cognition and feeling are interdependent, and I think they may be, then all of our aspects of consciousness, including what we're currently calling feeling or the affective content, is capable of development and verification. And if we really want to develop our thinking, then maybe we ought to think about how can we also advance our quality of feeling. So that's something I am personally interested in. So, system one, this idea of like the idea that we are kind of automatically reacting to things and based on this pattern recognition, it's not coming out of nowhere, it's coming out of experience. And so part of what I think that is interesting is that while this can be very problematic, because this is the aspect of mind. Does this make sense when I'm talking about system one? Like I said, I'm doing a super hatchet job on this research because, time. But, okay, so this is where implicit bias lives, as an example. This is where, we pick up these different patterns and we have these various biases that we're not aware of. So this is part of where that lives, and that is very problematic. But it's also where a lot of our better instincts live. So I think the point here is that this aspect is capable of having some training. And that's what a lot of ancient philosophy is about, is what a lot of religious contemplative traditions are about, is actually trying to train some of this by creating various types of experiences that you're then putting certain kinds of patterns out there that you incorporate. So one of the things that comes out of a lot of these different traditions is watch what you feed your mind. That's one. And when I think there's people that work on things like media bias, this is part of what we're feeding our minds. So this is part of where you can get these patterns. And then the other thing is that we tend to think in groups. But we are capable of scaffolding certain kinds of experiences, again, for good or for ill. So how many of you, or has anyone here heard of the hidden curriculum? Do you know these theories? Is there anyone, since I have now babbled a whole lot, who knows it and would like to explain it? Or yes.
Is that the idea of like how to do college? So you're not only learning content, like a good college student is not only one who remembers and can learn facts, but kind of knows like the system in a way?
Kind of. I mean, that could be an example of some of the hidden curriculum. So, okay, let me explain what this is. The hidden curriculum are all those things that people learn in schooling that are not being directly taught. And in fact, often the people who are engaged don't realize that they are even teaching them. So let me give you an example. Grading on the bell curve. Okay. If you grade on the bell curve, what are some of the things that people are learning about the nature of reality?
That your performance and assessment is always in relationship to other people.
That your performance is always in relationship to other people. What else? What else are they learning about that?
Competition.
Yeah, they are learning that there are always winners and there are always losers. They are learning, just because in the interest of time, I'm going to speed this up a little bit because you guys are getting the concept. They're learning that your success hurts me, and that this is the nature of reality. There's a whole bunch of stuff that people are learning in that is not explicitly being taught, and that the person grading on the bell curve may not even be aware of. But those are the kinds of things that go very deeply into system one. And then that becomes part of like that way in which we're interacting with reality. So there is a whole bunch of different kinds of things that are patterns that we pick up. So let's say we wanted to create a more intentional hidden curriculum. We wanted to try to create something that would inculcate a pattern that we want students to have, which could be some of this like how do you succeed in college kind of thing. I mean, I do think that's part of what something like AUX is trying to do. So I would like you to sit for a second again, so I'm going to get you back in small groups for like just a couple of minutes, but think through for yourself, what might we want to create if we wanted to inculcate a pattern in which watching your own mind is valued? Does that make sense what I'm asking you to do?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Think through with a partner, if you wanted to create something in your classroom or in a course or whatever that was going to teach students, not like directly like just saying, watching your mind is a valuable thing, but what would you do as a pattern to try to get them that? What's an intervention that you might have? Make sense? Okay. Let's do 2 minutes. Maybe 3. And like I said, just talk with somebody around you, get into what exercise groups you want at this point.
Before the test.
You know what I was thinking? An option of that was the idea instead of read class, I made this pattern that you want to share. Instead of that having each group do something different and then they have to teach together. Because that's forcing them to think, okay, I read this, I learned it. How did I learn it? And how do I show it?
How far are you? I'm fine.
And how do I teach it to others? Right. But not just like, because it looks like you have to know how you learn it so that you're doing it choice. Otherwise,
Oh my gosh.
you can just stand up there. It's like you use the metacognitive. They're right.
Okay, if there's anyone who's not had a chance to talk, switch. Depending on how you're doing it. I say if it's all of you talking together, that's fine. I just want to be sure. No, there were some people who seemed to be doing like one at a time, and so I was just saying we've got about like 1 more minute.
Things like,
Sorry, not clear.
whatever. There's sort of this thing they're learning that the professor knows better.
Right.
And if you're wrong, it's because they tell you.
Are we supposed to stop? Ring the bell.
Huh? Ring the bell. There we go. All right, we're gonna come back.
Right.
Thank you all. So, okay. So again, so we've talked a little bit now about like some of the different things that we could maybe do to help system 1, because that is the vast majority of where people are thinking, and creating different structures that would help maybe have experiences that would help them develop good patterns that we want them to have. That's a good thing. So system 2, let's go into that. Like where we think about, this is where we're usually considering kind of our higher order thinking. So again, the main issue is depletion. You can only do it for so long. And you can only do it under circumstances that you have enough energy and feel well enough and all of these different things. So system 2 is lazy because we're inefficient. So to me, then, when I'm hearing and looking at this research, the most important thing we can possibly do is try to make it more efficient so that we don't deplete as quickly, and including helping, obviously helping our students do that. So I think we all know that multitasking is terrible. It absolutely just drains, it's incredibly inefficient, drains the hell out of people. That's really hard though. We have a lot of our work life is set up in such a way that multitasking is hard to avoid. I mean, like in order to prepare for this and do my last minute preparation yesterday, I turned off my email and I got an urgent one that wanted me to respond within 15 minutes and I didn't see it, so I had to get phone calls instead. But some of those different things, I think a large part of the way in which we work really does kind of marshal against our ability to retain our resources or be efficient in how we use our minds. Exhaustion is crippling. Bodily challenges like hunger, even if unrecognized, is a big problem, which we just talked about that, where you can see that it affects judges. Thirst, most of the time we don't actually care enough to get the careful thinking mind activated. Like, I remember, do you guys like those Mensa puzzle things? Like those analytic puzzles? Some people do. I loathe them. I just don't care. I'm like, I don't care who's sitting next to who, So it was not until I actually had a high stakes one that I'm like, oh, I actually am good at this when I can make myself focus, because I sure don't find them interesting. But there are other people like my brother who loves them. But the point is, most of the time in life, we don't actually care enough to pull things in. So trying to get that activated. So as soon as we do any of these kinds of problems, we tend to take shortcuts. So for me, we can harp on developing higher order thinking skills as much as we want, but until we get more efficient, even if they're excellent, we don't use them effectively. And I actually think that's more often the problem than not, is that it's not so much that we lack higher order thinking, it's that we don't use it. There are an awful lot of very intelligent people who make incredibly stupid choices on a regular basis because they're just not slowing down. And again, to go back to that whole idea of stepping back, the biggest thing, the number one thing, is to force yourself to slow down. That's, the biggest trigger to go into like this thinking, is to just force that. So when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, how can we lighten the load for both us and our students? And one of the ways that is quite useful, and I put the citation and the bibliography here, is trying to figure out how to create checklists. Because what checklists do is they give us a structure that we don't have to carry around all the steps of something or the things to watch out for. It gives us a form that we can kind of go through and then just spend our higher order thinking on following and doing the analysis that is keyed in. So there's a book in there about, it was used by hospitals to try to cut way back on problematic things that are happening. So the doctors, instead of like having to focus on things that could be offloaded to a checklist, could actually focus on the higher order critical thinking skills and not get exhausted. And that was Dr. Gwendolyn, who, as I was reading this book, I'm like, this guy sounds really familiar. He's the one who was at Dr. Burwell's, at Sylvia Burwell's inauguration, President Burwell's inauguration. I'm like, I knew it was him. Okay. So anyway, that was an interesting book. So anything that helps us, I call it my externalized brains. Like any of those things that we don't have to carry and can offload into an externalized format, that's cognitive load we're not having to use up. So basically creating structures to help us focus our attention on issues of critical failure. So I made an attempt, and it is a rough attempt. I have not done everything that this requires, but I have made an attempt to give you an example of a thinking checklist to see whether or not this would be useful. And it is a draft. Feel free to use it or destroy it or whatever, but it's kind of an example of some of the major areas here. So the idea is, if we can have things that we're trying to check on, then we don't have to remind ourselves that these are things that we need to check on. We can just like go down the list and see. And then actually spend our mind and our metacognitive powers and reflective powers doing the actual reflection. So the first one I had, and the idea in a checklist is you don't put things in a checklist that almost never, but they're not critical points of failure. You try to recognize what are your critical points of failure to remind yourselves of. So assessing your state of mind, that like, okay, let me take a moment and take a look. Am I tired, hungry, thirsty, or in pain? if I am in any of these things, is there anything I can do to remediate it? As someone who has dealt with chronic pain, sometimes you just don't, but then you want to be aware that you are experiencing it, because you know it's going to give kind of a negative cast to your thinking. What am I feeling? And again, I gave you that list because I like those lists, because sometimes, you know, we all have linguists. You guys know this. You know, our vocabulary of things we understand is much smaller than the vocabulary of things that we can pull out of our mind at any moment to help us think. So, you know, something along those lines. So be aware of the cast, the positive or negative of your feeling, and the intensity. And if it's, I want to say, in particular, pay attention, and this is a good thing if we can get our students to help pay attention, anything that is on the fear or the revulsion spectrum. Those two sets of emotions, like the fear and revulsion, seem to have to do with our physical survival. Revulsion, or like being grossed out or finding something disgusting, any of that, that seems to have to do with disease avoidance. And so they are really, really powerful. It is very difficult to override fear or repugnance. And so when those get triggered, then it is really hard to engage anything other than trying to get away and destroy whatever that is. Which means that if we were OIT and our minds could be, you know, we would be getting like, warning, you are about to be hacked. Here's a security hole. This is where it's really easy to hack the human mind. You know, if you can engage fear or repugnance, it's really, really easy to get hacked. So those are the two especially, to just be like, am I feeling either of these? And if so, can I like really go slowly and be double and triple checking myself? Okay. Then I have signs of danger. If yes, slow down and be careful. So these are some of the big ones that are highlights to, if we hit these, then these are places where it's really easy for us to make major errors. So the first thing is, you know, and again, this idea of like checking on yourself. Is my immediate reaction to something a desire to refute or reject? If so, that is system one, it's hitting patterns, and it's hitting something where, you know, we need to be really, really careful. Also, is the topic by or about one of my culturally repugnant others? Which I find an interesting phrase that is being used, but I also, because it's partially, I think, really accurate, honestly. Again, maybe you're a bodhisattva or an ascended person or a saint and I'm not, but I don't believe that people don't have, I think everyone has somebody who's a culturally repugnant other, and that we need to be honest with ourselves. We don't necessarily have to externalize it, but be honest with ourselves about who that is so that we can recognize when it's happening. Because if that is being out there, then we need to step way, way, way back and go really slowly and be careful if it is by or about. Now, one of the theories on this, which I find really useful, is articulate to yourself the best possible version of whatever it is I desire to reject, and make yourself do that as a discipline, and that will improve your thinking tremendously. Yeah.
Would you just give a quick example of that?
Of like the articulate to yourself the best possible.
Choose a cultural repugnant other, we won't judge you, and like what you
Yeah, I mean, you know, yes. I find like people who are of the type that would wear MAGA hats, that's my culturally repugnant other. You know, and so when I am dealing with someone from that kind of, you know, and that partially has to do with my background, that partially has to do with a number of things, when I encounter that, I have sense of revulsion, and I am like immediately thrown into that tribalistic, I want to smack you kind of thing. And that means that I need to slow way the heck down, because it is not doing anybody any favors for me to dehumanize them, including my own character. So when I recognize that that is happening, back. And actually there's a lot of research right now, which is probably not going to be surprising to anyone in this room, that is saying that, you know, our biggest area of division right now in terms of where we have this kind of conflict of identity in this country, it's not about party affiliation, but it is kind of about political affiliation, liberal versus conservative. I mean, that is kind of where we're most having the likelihood of revulsion and this sort of thing. And like I said, when you see that in yourself, back way off and take a close look. So another thing that I do personally to try to be more aware, and again, I think is a good practice, is I always try to find, like on the more conservative side, because like I said, that's mine, recognize. People who hold those views who I believe are really good people, and I read them. So for instance, I read David Brooks. Now he's not going to be wearing a MAGA hat, he's not that, but he's definitely more conservative than I am, and he's careful, and I believe that he is a good person. So I read him, and I try to take that very seriously. I read certain theologians that have very different perspectives than I do, but I believe that they are good people. And part of what forcing myself to engage in that helps tremendously, and to be open to being influenced, and like having that as a discipline that I do.
So identifying that alternative is the best possible version of what you.
So yeah, try to understand from their perspective what is the best possible version of this argument. That doesn't mean that you have to convince it or take it on. It means that you like step back and articulate for yourself what is the best possible version of this. Now there are certain things that I'm going to come to the conclusion are still repugnant, and I'm going to be opposed to them. But at least what I've done is I've stepped way back, and I've made sure that I'm not just doing a gut reaction kind of thing. Because there's also Stephen Jay Gould had this very interesting place in which he said, and this actually goes into another one, that he believes that it is likely that thinking in dichotomies or oppositions may be almost written into the base code of our minds. And that is, again, one of those things where it is so natural to us that we have to be very, very careful about it. And again, that's we know that there's this in-group, out-group kind of thing. But thinking in dichotomies also. So does that make sense? Yeah, so again, it's not necessarily that you end up agreeing. It just means that you engage in a place where you're not engaging with the worst example of whatever it is that you're finding in opposition. You're trying to understand. Yeah? Make sense? Okay. And like I said, if nothing else, it does train your mind to slow down. So another thing that I have is, am I attempting to virtue signal? Which basically, do you all know virtue signaling? That's where you are demonstrating, again, we're all very social. And so if your immediate reaction is that you want to demonstrate your values or virtues to someone else, that's probably not actually about your thinking. That's probably about something else that's going on. So just be aware if that's, and again, all of these, it's not necessarily that it's bad, it's slow down and be careful. Am I thinking in dichotomies or oppositions? So if you find yourself thinking in dichotomies or oppositions, which like I said, may be part of kind of our natural tendency, and this is why I kind of like to move away from compare contrast, because it keeps reinforcing that. Sometimes it's useful, but almost more like what is the relationship between, because we just have this challenge of thinking in dichotomies. So one of the things that if you find yourself thinking in dichotomies, step back and say, are there other interpretations that are possible? Maybe it really is a dichotomy, but maybe it's actually a continuum. Maybe it's complementary. Maybe there's actually no relationship at all. So just step back and take an evaluative moment. Am I ignoring relevant things like other explanations or data? I like the Kahneman says, the danger of what you see is all there is. We have a cognitive bias towards focusing on what is in front of us and ignoring other things. So stepping back a little bit there. Are there a lot of metaphors? And how are they interacting with my worldview and the story of who and what I am? And that one is like, if you are thinking about something or you're reading something and a lot of the cognitive load is being used in metaphors, just be aware of the framing. Be aware of the framing, and then ask, how is this intersecting with my personal narrative about what the world is and who and what I am? And like, if it's either threatening to that or really super reinforcing, you might just want to be aware, like slow down and think. I also put in here some of the questions for reflection, which is whenever you're thinking about, like if you're reading something or hearing about something, what is my attention being directed towards? What's my attention being directed away from? Because again, attention is the main thing here. How does what I'm thinking or learning fit in with what I already know? That's a really good metacognitive question. And does it make me question anything that I already know? And if so, is that threatening? Because there's a couple of different things. What we think we already know are often tied in with our sense of self, and they're often tied in with our relationships and affiliations. And again, we're social. And so if it feels threatening, then, pull back and watch your mind more. And then these are some others that are kind of trying to get at that, like, points of reflection. This one's for transfer. What is one way in which this new knowledge or way of thinking could change my life based on what I'm thinking or learning? What is something else that I wish I knew? Those are good ways to kind of think about your thinking. What is the most important thing that I want to remember from this experience? And then if you can, and this was like in ancient Greece, this is a huge big thing in their learning, which again, like I said, I'm biased, it's my happy place. But one of the things that they considered to be a very high form of learning that was incorporated in everything is this idea that you create a mnemonic device. It's engaging the creative mind in order to help you fully integrate and carry whatever that is. There's things like Roy G. Biv, aphorisms, which are also proverbs, however it is, any kind of memory device, getting it down into a short, pithy statement that you can like carry around in your mind. So for example, one of the ones that I carry around in my mind that is from philosophy, a particular phrase, and this old one is just to give you a sense that, sometimes it's factual like Roy G. Biv, but sometimes it's like the all is mind, the universe is mental, held in the mind of the all. That is an incredibly abstract concept, but I can immediately access everything there because I can pull that phrase out, and that's an old aphorism that I have memorized. Mnemonic devices and aphorisms, you can have them make it, which engages their own creative thinking, or you can give it to them and it will help them remember. So anyway, that's my first draft that is not fully tested yet of a thinking checklist that I give you as an example though of both making a checklist that you can create. Another one that I actually have that is in there, it's a couple back. It's not exactly a checklist, but it's close. This is one I give to students in the library about evaluating stuff. So kind of to run down and ask themselves these questions. Again, this one I'm still refining, but this is just as another example of like, here are a bunch of things that when you're looking at a piece of research, you want to be asking yourselves questions about, and nobody is ever going to remember all of them, including me, and that's why I have a list. So I can, so that way I can spend what of that higher order thinking skills I have, actually asking myself these questions and doing the evaluation rather than trying to remember all the stuff that I'm supposed to remember in order to do evaluation. And I would gladly take any feedback on any of these, by the way, to improve them because these are always up for improvement. Okay. Methods of assisting. A lot of them are, for both reflection in terms of you can reflect on the topic material or you can reflect on your own thinking. They're very similar. I gave you some forms here. So the forms, there's the 1 minute paper, which we did one of. I was going to have you do another, but then I realized that we don't have much time. You can also do a 5 minute paper, but the idea in these is to just have people write without filtering. And you can ask questions. You can ask a specific question like, what is the most important thing you learned today and why? Or how will you use this in your life? Or any number of things. But it's to also give it like a time so that it doesn't seem daunting. And it can be 1 minute, it can be 5 minutes, but it's that way it's not like overthinking. The KWL is a way of just having something where you can have like 3 columns and say, okay, what do you know? What do you want to know? What did you learn? And again, that gets them to reflect on their thinking as well as some of the kind of integrative pieces. And wanting to know, that's where, of course, what has tripped your curiosity is always a good thing. Florilegia. Does anyone know that? Do you guys know this? I love Florilegia. Florilegia is actually, it's a sacred reading practice, but I use it in my notes, so I use it for non-sacred purposes. Which, the idea of this is basically like you choose your flowers. It's like picking flowers in a garden. You're reading something and you grab, there's a sparklet, there's something that's caught your attention, and you grab that sentence or that phrase or that, quote, that small quote, and you pull it out and you think about just that sentence and write about that. It's also kind of like how you can have those quote books. So I often find this very useful. So for me, it's like, I often will find here's the little, a sparklet or two is how I take notes a lot of times. I take notes in direct quotes of the sparklets and then I make comments on them. So, and that helps me integrate them. So that's one that I like. And again, kind of going into that aphorism, if I can figure out a way, if there's a sentence that really says the piece that I most want to remember, then I just work on remembering that sentence. And that makes it a lot easier. The think, pair, share, which we've done, think aloud. I was gonna have you do, if you guys, have you done think aloud? So part of what we did in thinking over here, but there's another piece, which is as a faculty member, and I am asking people, as a librarian, I am asking you, as part of when you're teaching students, part of what they don't have good cognitive models of anymore are like, what is good information? There was a time in which everyone had to go to a library and read what was in the library because that's the only place they could get their information, and so they knew they were learning about a topic, but what they didn't really realize in that hidden curriculum way that they were learning was they were constructing a model of this is what good information looks like. And then that goes into system 1, where you're kind of like, most of the way in which, I'm a librarian and I'm still using system 1 all the time. That kind of like matching of like, oh, this looks right, this looks right, this looks right. Oh, no, wait, something's wrong there. And then that's where you engage your kind of critical thinking. They don't have those models. They don't have those models. These, they grew up, the students that we're dealing with now, the undergrad students that, most of us are dealing with now, they grew up in a time in which everything was pushed to them by browsers that is more interested on what do you like. So they have a working model of confirmation bias. And of course they do. That's the model that's been created for them. So, when you're doing this, if you can be talking about, this is why this is a good piece of research. They don't know that otherwise. So thinking aloud and externalizing your thinking about like, this is why I would assign this to you, and these are some of the things that I'm looking at. So think aloud is a little weird, I would have to do, because you're reading and you're like, so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like, especially for anyone who's in any way on an introverted part of the spectrum, making yourself do this a few times privately or with like one trusted person and then doing it in front of your class, but it helps them because it scaffolds your expert knowledge and your actual thinking process. So think aloud, really useful. And then having them do that with each other. Peer teaching. You never really learn something until you try to teach it. Having a transfer journal. That's again, is a journal that's specifically focused on how does this relate to other things I'm doing in this class? How does this relate to other things I'm trying to learn? How does this relate to my life? Just having them focus on those sorts of things. Creative expression, we went through some of that. They can also do graphics. End of the day reflection, beginning of the day goal setting. And then I gave you a whole bunch of prompts. I'm sure you can come up with even better ones, but these are ones that would help with reflection. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question related to peer teaching. It's something I use a lot, but I get evaluations from students saying, I'm paying for this class to learn from you, not my peers. And so, which I think is valid in some respects. So maybe it's about, I don't know if you just have a reaction or what your thoughts are about that, because I do think there's value in teaching it to others, and also there's lots of reasons to do peer teaching, but I've gotten that from undergrad and grad students.
Yeah, I don't know. Is it maybe a proportion thing? Do I think it's too much of the proportion of it? I don't know. I gotta admit that I am in an unusual circumstance in that I am not teaching a course, nor do I receive teaching evaluations. We go in as guest lecturers. I do a lot of teaching of various sorts in my other existence and my other hats, which is, but those are for people who are also not paying. They're just for people who want to come learn about Greek philosophy with me on their spare time. So, yeah, I'm wondering if it's a proportion thing.
Yeah, I've come into the same thing. One thing I try to do is I make the students meet with me, like I do a team. The team has to do it, and they have to meet with me ahead of time and define learning objectives. And I think the process of preparing them to teach, they feel like they've gotten something out of it, and I've funneled hopefully something, helped give them something
and
useful
do some quality control beforehand as well.
Quality control, but also that process. I think they've gotten a lot of that out of that process, and it's pretty good by the time the other folks see it, and the other folks know that I influenced it, so they feel like it wasn't.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, that is a good one. So just real quickly, because we now have 2 minutes. The graphic organizers, you can go online, you can find all sorts of things. I attempted to make one for you. I am almost entirely auditory. That's another one of the know your thinking styles. I could not come up with one that was not completely crappy, so I did not give you one of those because it's just not I can't do the visual. I just can't. I have to rely on other people. But there are good kind of mind maps. I was trying to do a mind map. So I can do some of them. I can do the simple ones, but I honestly, if it requires any kind of artistic ability whatsoever, I cannot do it. But there are students who really do learn well that way, and there's good templates that are online because this is used in a lot of lower ed now, which the templates are helpful if you cannot draw, and I cannot. The one thing I would say about those is that I've seen these used really badly, and that I have seen things where, you know, the aesthetics take over the logic of things. So I guess that's a danger where I've been like, well, you put those in a circle, but that's because you had a circle template. There is nothing logically that makes those go in a circle. So, you know, there is a certain amount of being aware of kind of how those get used, because I've definitely seen them used badly. But I've also seen them used in ways that there are people who learn and think very differently than I do, who have benefited from them. And we are at time. So, thank you. I do want to say on the very back page, there is a the evaluation form, including with QR code if you want to do fancy things. Under normal circumstances, but you're already doing this, so hopefully there's some feedback I can get. I would do the kind of like, tell me one thing that you learned, tell me one thing that I should definitely keep the same, tell me one thing that I really ought to change up. I mean, I like to do those just so that it helps me. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope this was useful. And if I can ever do anything for you, let me know.